Okay, good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending on where you are and joining us. On behalf of the Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at AUB in Beirut, I'm very happy and very honored to welcome our fantastic speakers for this webinar about Syria and the new phase after the election or the re-election of Bashar al Assad. Of course, this re-election is not completely something new since it's an ongoing rule in Syria, but we can say that this re-election is sort of a stabilization, let's say, or let's say, consolidation of the regime. The second aspect of this new phase is that most probably the big military operations in Syria are now over. The war is over, although there are still some consequent pockets of instability and maybe war, and we will have to talk about that. Also, most of the big questions that were at the root of the Syrian conflict are still on the table. They are still open. The question of the regime, the political equation, and now added to it the economic situation and probably the ruin of Syria for decades to come that is a lingering question. These are issues that we will devote many webinars in the future for. We will talk about Syria specifically, domestically and internally, but today we wanted to approach this new phase with mainly the international and regional stakeholders, and to see how they look at this phase, how do they read it, how are they preparing for it, and what remains of their interests in the beginning, from the beginning of the conflict, and how are they looking for the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years in Syria. This is why we're very happy to have this very prestigious lineup. We will have people from or talking on, because they are expert from Iran, of course. Thank you, Said Kazim. From the US, thank you, Natasha. From people talking on the Gulfi, let's say, point of view, thank you, Dr. Hussein Ibish. People talking from Turkey, Dr. Oytun Orhan. And last but not least, of course, the European point of view with Emma Beals. I'm very sorry for now, at least, that our Russian guest, Dr. Irina Zveyskaya, I'm sorry for mispronouncing the name, is so far absent. I hope that she will join us in the first minutes of this webinar, and we will have a very complete and very exhaustive roundup. This is why, and this is a quick note on organization, you are 6 speakers. If we want to leave some room for questions, I will urge you to be brief in your answers, and I will start let's say, my turn or my round of questions with you, Dr. Sami Khiami, because you will express here in this webinar the Syrian voice, and you are the first and foremost concerned about this issue. After all, this is Syria, although regional and international stakeholders' views are important, but this is after all and first and foremost your issue and your country. And we would like to understand from you, what does this new phase, if of course you accept that there's a new phase, what does this new phase mean for Syria and for the Syrians? Are the people in Syria feeling that there's a new phase or not? What is their, let's say, ranking of the priorities of things that are still to be done in this country? And what are for you, at least, the remaining questions that will, let's say, weigh on the landscape of Syria for the years to come? Dr. Sami Khiami, you were a former ambassador of Syria in London, in the UK for a while. You were a prominent ambassador. Now you are living in Beirut. You are, let's say, someone who is maybe critical sometimes of the regime, but you are not specifically talking someone in the opposition, but you're no more also from the regime. So I think that you have a freedom of speech, and we are very eager to listen to you. The floor is yours, Dr. Sam. You unmute, please. Unmute yourself.
I'm used to be muted. To answer your first initial question, I have asked a notable in Idlib the other day, what is the political entity that has the most popular vote in Idlib, in the Idlib province? And he said to me, feed us, help us. This is the party of feed us, help us that would win the election at any time. And the situation in Damascus is even worse, in Aleppo is even worse. So basically, the new phase in Syria does not look to be in any way affected by the elections, by the new election. Is there a new distribution of cards in Syria? Presidential elections have taken place in Syria, but irrespective of their credibility, one has to notice something important. The president is no longer surrounded by an inner circle or a circle of trusted generals and politicians with whom he confers, which used to be the case until 2018, but by a broader system of powerful individuals and interests that include part of the army and security services, some business and industry people, local militias, heads of gangs of organized smuggling and drug dealers, acting in a relatively autonomous fashion and influencing his decisions related particularly to internal security and business matters. The resilience of the system, and as well as its pitfalls, namely brutal repression, corruption, and favoritism, are today the direct product of this state of affairs. However, can we assume a change in the game of distribution of cards in the country? My answer is no, because the current status quo in Syria does not seem to disturb much the main interfering countries or impose on them any sense of urgency in finding a prompt solution to the Syrian tragedy. The new US administration, to start with, does not consider Syria a priority, although its influence in Syria is notable due to its direct military presence, its Kurdish allies, and its proxies in the south of the country. In the recent years, the US has been piloting the Syrian crisis, leaving the Russians in command, but making their achievement limited to saving the regime, without being able to reach a sustained peace settlement followed by a political solution. The Biden administration has started to engage recently with the Russians on humanitarian issues, but not yet on the early recovery or the early survival of Syria. Russia, on the other hand, has the upper hand in the government-controlled areas, but is faced with the dilemma imposed by the US and the West in general of not wanting Russia to succeed without a price that it may probably have to pay locally or elsewhere, including recently distancing itself from China, which is highly improbable. Therefore, Russia feels that it cannot afford putting substantial pressures on the Syrian regime to undertake drastic changes in its policy, and cannot even ask the Iranian militias to leave Syria or even limit their activities, unless the West decides to engage in a positive way with it and accredit it with enough support to devise the right political agreed upon solution for Syria. Europe has opted for more patience regarding the Syrian crisis until a political solution is reached. It has mainly provided asylum for many Syrian refugees, offered substantial humanitarian assistance, and funded a large number of projects to enhance the various capabilities of the Syrian civil society. Some European countries, though, are contemplating a policy of more for more with Russia and the Syrian regime. It is not excluded to see few European embassies and cultural centers to open their doors in Damascus, in a move intended to stay in touch with the Syrian society and not necessarily to start cooperation with the government. Turkey now feels that it is the right moment to assert its supremacy in the region, in view of the weakness of all the other regional players. Let us remember that Turkey's ambitions are not limited to its concerns about the Kurdish semi-autonomous administration in northeastern Syria, but they also openly express their desire to become a main player in the Arab region and in Central Asia, and also in the extraction of gas in the East Mediterranean as well. However, Turkey seems to be striking a balance between its NATO membership, dear to its heart, and the de facto rapprochement with Russia, which may lead, and this is important, to a new agreement of splitting influence in the Idlib region at the expense of the al-Nusra Front. Further addressing of Turkish concern has to be achieved by both the US and Russia together in convincing the Kurds of the Northeast to implement better governance and more power sharing with competing Kurdish parties and with the Arab majority in the region. Other measures of economic nature can also be devised to convince Turkey to limit its interference in Syrian affairs. Iran now is under tremendous pressure, and for the first time perhaps, a good deal of the Iranian intelligentsia is increasingly questioning the involvement of their country in Syria. Iran, however, cannot afford a total withdrawal from Syria and will negotiate to keep its channels open to the Mediterranean Sea and Lebanon. As for the Arab Gulf countries, they seem to have started the step-by-step process of economic normalization with the Syrian government against some reciprocal moves by the Syrians in human rights issues, in the Lebanese issue, and possibly a review of their relations with the northeast of Syria and the southern region of Syria. All this, of course, in the absence of any Syrian effective contribution. This is why, elections or no elections, not a lot of things will change. The Syrians are essentially represented by the government and the opposition, while both of them put together, government and opposition, do not enjoy the support of more than 20 to 30% of the Syrian public opinion. Recommendations related on how to revitalize the role of the Syrian society in search of a suitable peace is not the subject of this webinar and can be elaborated in future webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. Thank you very much, because in fact you laid out a little bit the outline of this webinar by talking about the several stakeholders. I'm very happy that at this very same moment we are joined by our Russian guest, Dr. Irina Zvyagelskaya, who is joining us from Moscow. I'm waiting for her to connect because she was supposed to be my next speaker. In fact, you mentioned a lot, Dr. Sami, Russia and Iran, and this is, I think, part of the conundrum today in Syria and of the new phase. The question is to know exactly what is, in fact, which one of these two is the most potent backer of the regime. And we will probably devote some time during these 2 hours to discuss this issue. Dr. Irina, good afternoon. Are you hearing me? Dr. Irina, are you hearing us?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Me. Thank
Good
you.
evening,
Thank you.
Irina, and thank you for joining. We're sorry for you to be late. In fact, you just popped up at the moment you should do, because we were transitioning from a few remarks from Dr. Sami Khiami on Syria itself, where he in fact mentioned at length Russia and Iran and their role. And I wanted to turn to you now and start by saying that, you know, the perception, true or false, is that Russia is today the new mandatory power in Syria, and Syria is today a Russian, let's say, protectorate. First of all, how much is this true in Moscow's view? And what is exactly Russia today expecting from the new phase, from Bashar al Assad himself and his regime in terms of political solution and, you know, this entire political question that is still open? And also, in parallel to that, what is the state of relation between Moscow, the US on one side, and then the partners of the Astana process that is in fact managed by Russia, meaning Turkey and Iran? So on all these questions, I'm very, very eager to listen to you. So the floor is yours, Irina. If you can turn your video on, this would be even better.
Okay. Okay. Hello. Thank you for having me. It wasn't easy to join you, but fortunately I'm here, and I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for this event because I believe you managed to bring people together at the right time. There were elections in Syria, which were greeted by a large part of the society, not because they are so much in love with Assad, but because they believe, as far as I see, that probably his being in power can guarantee now stability, certain national reconciliation, because in Syria they all speak about reconciliation. It doesn't mean that they mentioned Geneva in this case, but they point out that the most important issue today is identity, Syrian identity. So they are ready to ignore to some extent probably the rights of the minorities, because they are eager to have this Syrian identity at last, because it symbolizes for them the preservance of the state. Otherwise they're afraid it will go into pieces. That is why they do not accept the idea of either federalization or even decentralization, because they don't know, as decentralization is concerned, they simply don't know what it is. And they're afraid that if there is no strong leader in power, then Syria will not survive as a unitarian state. This is one point. So the second point, and it is very important, because when I
Irina, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, Irina. I'm sorry, but there is a small sound in your system, in your mic. Can you fix this, or is there something on your mic that is impeding the sound?
No, nothing. There is nothing. No.
Okay, please go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry. So what I want to say is that when Russia says that it supports the election of Assad, it doesn't mean that we only support Assad and we don't see any alternative. We don't see any alternative right now. But we believe that if right now these elections were not accepted by the Syrians themselves, there would have been again a chaos and again an eruption of tensions. So since Assad is elected, it is pragmatic to take it as a fact. That's first. Second, if you hear what the Syrians say, they demand more and more from Russia. Russia is nothing like mandatory power in Syria, and much more is demanded from the people in power, from the people in the streets. So they want a more active role of Russia in economic development of Syria. They want more investments. They want more soft power, like bringing people again to Russian institutions and universities to study, and like establishing our own universities or high schools in Syria itself. Sometimes we are told that we have to give more gas to Syria. They really need it, and oil products, but Iran is more or less covering the shortages. And some oil they still have in Syria, but they have problems, and you know, they don't have electricity the whole day. And even in Damascus, there are very serious problems. So what is expected from Russia? Not so much its activity in defending the regime, but I mean military defense, but rather more economic power and more soft power right now. So this is what they are looking forward. As far as Astana process is concerned, there is a problem, and the main problem is Idlib, you know. And here probably some Syrians still have, well, I would say certain ideas that Russia might help in liberating Idlib, but I doubt it very much. I doubt it very much. It seems to me that probably Idlib will remain a problem for the time being. I don't think that Russia can change the situation, really. If there is a problem with the sound, I shall try to switch to other device. Just a moment.
Maybe Irina, maybe we'll go back to you. You want to go on?
Yeah, I will switch to another device.
Okay, please go ahead. Go
ahead. This one is not working properly.
Great, go ahead, please. Please go ahead, Irina. Can you go ahead? Can you listen to us? Can you hear us? Okay, we'll get back to you in a few minutes, maybe. Let me turn to you, Sayyid Kazim, and Iran. Irina has, said often that there is a kind of competition, if not rivalry, between Iran and Russia, at least on the economic front. Let us go beyond that and take the broader picture. Many people think that if Russia is the visible, let's say, protector of the regime, Iran is in fact even more invisibly, or even though more invisibly, it's the real backer, in fact, of the regime, and maybe the real winner of this war, because it has invested a lot, and the return on investment is seemingly very today, let's say, juicy. How much do you share this view? And in the new phase to come, and especially if we put, so on the one hand, Syria as such, and what Iran is hoping to benefit from in Syria, but also on the regional level, how will Syria be integrated in the equation of the negotiation ongoing between Iran and the US and Iran in the Gulf in the coming years? So what is Syria's role or function in this equation, and what are you expecting to do from the huge, let's say, benefit and gain that Iran has extracted from Syria? The floor is yours, Sayyid Kazim. I just forgot to say that Besides being a very prominent academic, you are the president of a very important think tank in Iran. You have had also very prominent official positions. You were former advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, or actual. You have been ambassador or deputy ambassador to the UN, and so you are very privy to the corridors of Tehran's foreign policy, or at least some of the corridors of Tehran's foreign policy. So we are very eager to listen to you too. Thank you, Said Kazim, for being with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here in such a very distinguished scholars and policy analysts, and I do thank you for having this webinar. But you had let me first have a disclaimer that whatever I say is my own, so it's not the Iranian view, it is an Iranian view. Usually I start by a joke that what's the difference between a general, because we are talking about military theater in a way, a diplomat or an ambassador and a scholar or policy think tanker. And the answer is, if you ask a question from a general and you hear yes, the answer is yes. If you hear no, the answer is no. If you hear maybe, that person is not a general, because they should be very precise, dead on the mark. If you ask an ambassador a question and you hear yes, the real answer may be maybe. And if you hear maybe, the real answer is no. If you hear no, that person is not a diplomat. And if you ask a question from, let's say, a scholar or a think tanker, you never hear yes or no. You hear on the one hand is this, on the other hand is that. We need conceptual frameworks. So I try to really raise a conceptual framework, reading your previous, let's say, invitation, and look at the Syrian issue in post-election time, and then, of course, address your questions. So the question is how we can understand the situation as it is. I think analytically, let's have a picture. But before answering this question, I have to say Syrian conflict is one of the most, let's say, crowded in terms of players, in terms of perspectives, and in terms of, let's say, play cards. So it's not an easy conflict. Everybody has its normative view, which we don't want to get, be it, let's say, official or unofficial. However, I think the situation can be understood by 3 S. First S, I call self-confidence mood in Damascus. That's very important. I think this election gave President Bashar al Assad a sense of more self-confidence. And I think the psychological dimension of this election is very important. Whether you like it, whether you like what you call regime or a state, whatever you want, there is a psychological dimension. And I think this issue is very, very important for analytical reasons to understand the situation. That means there is going to be more personal role for him. That means also more time and space being thought about. So he thinks that he has more time. There is no urgency for some of the political questions that they were posing internationally or from outside, and also a space. And I think this is very important point. Second is what I call is a stability perspective. The situation seems by this election more stable or moving toward more stability. And here we see, first of all, the issue of recovery, economic recovery, as one of the most important one. Of course, Iran is an actor here, which I touch a little bit upon it. The issue of rehabilitation, I mean, in social terms, this election served a little bit, or to some extent, on this dimension of rehabilitation socially. Finally, I think the issue of reestablishing relationship with Damascus by Arab states and some non-Arab states is an important factor of showing the, let's say, the concept of stability on move. But my third S is what I call the structural problems. The structural problems remain the same. And on the military term, I think it is the occupation, no doubt. It is occupation there. And you have American, regardless of what Biden is saying, I think they have increased the number of their forces. Now they have 2,800 forces, and I think up to 1,000 was increased recently, I mean, during the Biden time. And you have Turkish, about 90 military, let's say, spots, and you see occupation by all, even measures changing the population, the language, even the monetary system. I think these are, let's say, the structural challenges. On economic side, I think the issue of the sanctions remain. And I think this sanctions is a challenge and actually a paradox for Europeans, because Europeans, on one hand, they think of humanitarian dimension, but on the other hand, they talk about sanction. And I think this is a challenge. And I think on a structural problem, you have also the diplomatic challenge. You see Astana process, of course. We had a meeting of Astana just 2-3 weeks ago. Very important issues were discussed, but you see an attempt to create different spaces of diplomatic interactions and to follow whatever was not possible by military, let's say, tools, maybe by diplomatic tools, which I think is a combination of instruments in this regard. But however, the challenges are there. And I think with the psychology, with the issue of feeling more stable, these issues, managerial style of these issues may be of different nature, but in an incremental way. Now on Iran, I think 3 C's would explain Iranian position. C, consistency. Iran has been consistent on this issue of Syria from the beginning. I think we were not, let's say, impressed by all these issues that, it's about democracy. It's about, of course, democracy, human rights are very important. And as a human being, nobody can ignore it. But I think there was let's say, a strategy game. And I think in this strategy game, the security of Iran also was at stake. And I think this is very, and I have to say, we have a very dynamic, pluralistic society, debating society. But on the issue of security, I think there is a consensus, and this is where you have to keep in mind that consistency of Iranian position on Syria is clearly there. Second, I think Iran, second, is contributor, of course, to the especially economic reconstruction. And I think Iranians on different dimensions of economic issues are involved, and they try to really help. And my third C is Iran is cooperative on diplomatic level. And I think Astana is an example of this. I don't think the issue of competition or issue of rivalry or this, what I call oversimplification of a strategic theater can really explain the realities there. It is a very complex, multi-dimensional issue, but I think Iran attaches importance regardless of what the others may narrate. We take the issue of Syria seriously. Now, on your final position, I think the nuclear file doesn't have any relationship with the Syrian, though psychologically some people may think of the linkages, but I think Iranian position is clear, consistent, that nuclear file has its own logic, and the other issues have their own. And I think the issue of Iranian-Syrian connection has its own strategic logic. So to end, in order to stay in your frame of time, I think as I see the situation is can be studied more from, let's say, a political psychological perspective. So the political psychology in Damascus and change in that dimension has ripple effect on other issues, though the strategic, let's say, context remains the same. I would be more than happy to answer your other questions at a later time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Said Kazim. I think it was a very, very important and very interesting contribution. I'll get back to you with some specific questions. Some of them you opened or you alluded to, the issue of consistency, the issue of also collaboration or cooperation. We'll get back to that in a minute. Now let me turn to you, Natasha, and the other side, let's say, of the fence in Syria. We were saying that Russia and Iran are probably the bigger winners of this conflict. I don't know if the US is the biggest. The question is the US interest in Syria, if not lost Syria itself? What remains of the interest of the US in Syria per se as such, besides the fact that Syria is one, let's say, chess box on the big, let's say, chess game with Iran. What is the view of the US on this country? How far is it still a contentious point between the US and Russia? What happened exactly during the summit between Presidents Putin and Biden on Syria? Was it at all on the table? And then if you have a little bit of time remaining, if not in the second round of question, what is Washington intending to do in the parts it is still present in Syria, mainly the northeast and relative also to the Kurdish question? Natasha, you're a senior fellow at the Brookings, at the CSIS, at the Center for Security and International Studies in Washington. If I'm not wrong, you have some Syrian blood, if I'm not wrong, and you mainly work on humanitarian issues pertaining to Syria and the region at large. We're very happy to have you with us. The floor is yours for also 6 to 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thanks to my fellow panelists for giving us all some food for thought already. I'm actually not Syrian, I'm Jordanian, but I did have Jordanian relatives that fled to Syria many decades ago, so maybe they're Syrians at this point. So, I mean, the Biden administration is still assessing its Syria policy, so I can't really get into the details, but we have seen the administration lead with more diplomacy and aid, and that probably relieved a lot of friends and foes alike in the region and beyond. But once you strip the varnish, there are very few differences that would significantly change things on the ground. And I mean, if you look back on the past 10 years, not only would this recent presidential election not factor into US policy on Syria, but very little, if anything, has affected US policy towards Syria throughout, very different US administrations. Minor things were changed when it came to, which armed groups were supported, where stabilization funding was spent. But the only event to really increase the US footprint was the emergence of ISIS. Nothing at the end of the day was changed to address the core issue, which displaced half the country and destroyed hundreds of billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. And that was primarily the bombardment of civilian populated areas, arbitrary arrests, and sieges. But I think that there were three issues that dictated that this would always be the case, so no one should be surprised, and it continues to be the case. And the first is the US's desire, starting with the Obama administration, to pivot foreign policy focus to Asia. So this made the Arab Spring kind of a hopeful time, but the crises that ensued ended up being more of a nuisance to US administrations rather than issues that needed to be properly dealt with. The second was probably the intervention in Libya, frankly, and the consequences from that, and arguably the deadlock that it created at the Security Council as well. And third, and perhaps most importantly, is Russia's military intervention in 2015, which kind of put the nail in the coffin for any significant US intervention or international intervention to protect civilians. I remember John Kerry at the time said to someone from the Syrian opposition in a private discussion, what do you expect us to do? Go to war with Russia? So within that shrinking framework, the Biden administration is trying to sort out an agenda for Syria, or rather, I would argue a limited containment strategy, given the current reality on the ground. And within the first few months, I think the administration has given us some signals on how they're going to handle Syria. And the first speaks to the question that you had about the Northeast. I think that they wanted to secure the fact that they were going to remain in the Northeast, these few hundred troops that are in Northeast Syria, but also publicly define what the goal was for that presence. And that was to curb the reemergence of ISIS in the region, not to create, a Kurdish-led or SDC-led statelet, not to develop oil fields or anything else. And the fact that arguably the administration's first major decision on Syria was not to extend a license for a US oil company called Delta Crescent Energy in Northeast Syria kind of points to this desire to at least publicly reaffirm its limitations. We can get into the discussion later about what the presence actually means in reality, but that is at least what the administration is trying to say publicly. The second is, as I mentioned, the administration's declared pivot from the Middle East. They didn't point a Syria envoy. They shrunk their team at the National Security Council devoted to the Middle East. And with regards to Syria specifically, rather than forcefully preventing Arab partners from normalizing with the Assad government, the new policy is simply to really state to Arab allies, we don't think you're going to get anything out of normalization with the government, but let us know if you can. And I think that this is actually also a major departure from the previous administration. The third is what we've seen in the past few weeks. The administration using Syria as kind of a stress test for US-Russia diplomacy. And we've seen this in the past few weeks with the ongoing debate over the UN cross-border mandate in particular. And it showed that the Biden administration would rather lead with concessions than sticks with Russia. And I think that that's important for us all to keep in mind. It also showed what it was willing to put on the line when it came to Syria. So they acknowledged that early recovery assistance, which is very akin to reconstruction, frankly, and cross-line aid could work without any improvement on the ground or political dialogue. So I think that's a big win for the Russians that's somewhat buried under this elation over extending the UN cross-border mechanism. That said, the administration did go out of its way not to tie the resolution to sanctions, which leads me to the fourth point. There's an ongoing assessment of sanctions policy right now towards Syria. I don't think that the lack of new sanctions or the lifting of some sanctions speaks to where this could be headed. I think that we're still in a moment of flux, and I think a lot of it is heavily dependent on Congress, which is out of the administration's hands. But certainly there's a recognition of harmful secondary effects on aid programming, for example, and maybe a recognition that you could tie sanctions to more concrete or feasible goals. But again, I think that the administration is going to be limited in this, so that kind of remains to be seen. And the fifth, and probably the most important difference, is the increase in stabilization and humanitarian assistance. So the Biden administration unfroze stabilization assistance and increased humanitarian aid to all parts of Syria. But it is unclear how the administration is going to deal with manipulation of aid in all of these areas. US and European partners are supposed to take the lead on establishing and implementing principles and parameters when it comes to aid. But without more consistent diplomacy, this is going to be difficult. So none of these moves should be a surprise, given the overarching strategy to pivot away from the Middle East, to avoid conflict with Russia for now, and to contain the crisis. However, there's a lack of clarity on how the administration would handle an increase in tensions or spillover, which is always around the corner in Syria. So for example, if there's an increase in hostilities and more displacement in the Northwest, or if the regime uses chemical weapons again, it's unclear what the administration would do. There would probably be more humanitarian aid, maybe increased assistance to Turkey to be able to hold the ceasefire, but certainly more diplomacy with Turkey for many reasons will be needed. And it's unclear if the administration is going to prioritize that or not. The other thing is something that we've seen, particularly in the past few weeks as well, which is Iranian proxies increase on attacks on US forces and assets. It's clear that US retaliatory strikes thus far are proving ineffective. So it remains to be seen how much this needs to escalate before the Biden administration sort of develops a clearer plan or strategy for dealing with this. And then, the ISIS resurgence, I guess, is also always around the corner. So what would it take for the US administration to increase its military footprint? What would Turkey do if it, came to the SDF or the Syrian Democratic Forces aid when it came to this? These are all questions that remain outstanding, but these are all issues which are not just likely, but they're possible. So they do require a plan of action, but I'm looking forward to the discussion and talking a bit more and unpacking this and responding to any other questions. But thank you, Joseph.
Thank you so much, Natasha. This was very, very clear and exhaustive, and also many questions are still pending, and we'll get back to you. Thanks a lot. And you offered me the perfect transition to go to Oytun Orhan, our colleague from Turkey. He's at Orsam, one of the main Levant and Arab Research Center in Ankara. Thank you so much, Oytun, for being with us today. Let me start maybe by provoking you a little bit by saying that probably the party that lost, if not the most, but very much in Syria is Turkey. If we compare Turkey's ambition in 2011 to what we are today. So the question is, what is remaining of Turkey's, let's say, defense lines in Syria? I mean, now it has retrenched to some the protection of some very specific interests in the north, maybe in Idlib and in the northeast. It is probably, let's say, very much uncomfortable with being forced to recognize that the regime will survive, at least for now, which opens the question of neighborhood and the way it will deal with it. Also looming, and this is what Natasha was alluding to, a difficult relation with the US. That will weigh on Syria, and a very sensitive relation with Russia and with Iran that is also weighing on the Astana format and on the future of Turkish strategy in Syria. With all these parameters in the equation, how would you answer the question that is, how is Turkey preparing for the new phase, and how much is it still, let's say, betting on winning something in Syria? Thank you so much, Oytun, and the floor is yours now.
I thank you very much, Joseph Bahut, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this great event, and also speaking with all distinguished scholars and also colleagues. The Turkish suffering from Syria, I think nobody is the winner from the Syrian conflict. Everybody is the loser. I don't see any winner, although you mentioned that Russia and Iranians could be the winners from the Syrian civil war, which I don't think so. They already are suffering from the Syrian conflict. Turkey is also one of the losers of the Syrian conflict. That's the one part. But on the other hand, I could also say that the Syrian conflict gave an opportunity to Turkey to inject power to other areas, because thanks to the Syrian conflict, Turkey started to use its hard power, which is also very effective in Syria, and spread to this hard power to the neighboring areas, including Libya, East Med, Nagorno-Karabakh, maybe Ukraine, and other areas. So in some cases, the Syrian conflict also paved the way for Turkey to enhance its influence and strength to the neighboring areas. But in overall, of course, in Syria, Turkey do not want to increase its influence, but trying to minimize the risks originating from the Syrian territory. So in my presentation, I will try to focus on the Turkish priorities, Turkish threat perceptions from Syria. I will not deal with the Turkish foreign policy in general. At the first stage of the Syrian conflict, Turkey applied a pressure and isolation policy, which were trying to force the Assad regime to give up its rule. So in that manner, Turkey used diplomatic and political and economic tools to pressure Assad regime to give up their rule. But in time, the main character of the Syrian civil war had evolved. It totally changed. The main character of the civil war had turned to a civilian uprising, to an armed conflict between the Syrian state and the armed opposition forces. And the ethnic and sectarian character of the conflict had become more visible. And the rise of radical groups and terror organizations which claim sovereignty, mainly on the Turkish border areas, that became more prominent in the civil war. So the changing character of the Syrian civil war totally changed the Turkish priorities and perception of the Syrian conflict. So unlike the previous priorities, the current priorities in Syria is mainly fight against terrorism. It was ISIS at the beginning. In 2013 and 14, Turkey was facing huge ISIS attacks on its border towns and also in major cities like Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir in touristic areas. So since the establishment of Turkish Republic, Turkey had faced the biggest terrorist attacks it had experienced in this era. Not thanks, of course, but the border sharing with ISIS gave the organization an opportunity to penetrate into Turkey easily and also conduct these kind of terror operations. But apart from ISIS, of course, YPG, the PKK branch in Syria, PKK offshore in Syria, which Turkey is fighting since 1980s. YPG posed a huge threat towards Turkey. It also claimed a unilateral sovereignty on the Turkish border areas, the so-called cantons on the border. So the rise of these two terror organizations on the Turkish border area totally changed the Turkish perception towards Syria. And in that regard, the fight against terrorism had become a priority in Turkey's Syria policy. Still, it is the case. ISIS had been contained. ISIS is not a problem for Turkey. It's a problem for Turkey, but not only for Turkey. It was also a problem for the international community, so it had been dealt with it. So now it had become a security problem, not a strategic problem for Turkey, but YPG is still a strategic problem, threat for Turkey's perception towards Syria. Secondly, of course, preserving Syria's territorial integrity and political unity. This is also in line with the YPG problem, because YPG is the only actor who is asking for a federal state structure in Syria. Turkey thinks that in case of an Iraqi-like or Lebanon-like structure will be established in Syria, this will pose a huge existential threat towards Turkey, which will also undermine Turkey's own territorial integrity and political unity. So in that regard, this principle is a huge concern for Turkey. Border security is, of course, very important for Turkey. At the beginning, Turkey applied an open door policy in Syria. So in that regard, all civilians and also armed groups and political activists were free to operate on the border area. But in time, as the radical groups and terror organizations strengthened their position on the border area, Turkish perception towards that policy had changed, and now Turkey is trying to fully control the border. And in that regard, the wall had been established from the Iraqi border. from to the Mediterranean Sea. So the whole border is now controlled by the walls and also by all technological means. Border security is very important for Turkey, and also the refugee issue. It's also a major concern for Turkey. At the beginning, Turkey, as I said, was applying an open door policy and was welcoming all refugees coming from Syria. But in time, the numbers became critical, and it created an internal anger, a resentment within Turkish public on the economic side, political side, and also it affected the refugee issue, the Syrian issue in Turkey. It also affected the elections, the internal politics in Turkey. So in that regard, now the government is also trying to prevent any kind of cross-border mass migration movements on the border area. So the refugee issue is very critical. But although the Turkish priorities have changed, this does not mean that Turkey fully give up its commitment to political opposition, armed opposition. Turkey is still committed to reach a solution, political solution in which the opposition forces in Syria will have a role in the future of Syria. So we can discuss this later, but still Turkey is committed to this issue and is the guarantor of the Syrian opposition forces. So in that regard, what Turkey is doing, unlike the first phase, Turkey is not using diplomatic or political tools or economic tools to inject power in Syria, but mainly using military tools and hard power in Syria to fulfill these interests. Turkey had conducted 4 cross-border military operations, and as a result of that, 4 operation areas under full Turkish control, and 1, which I mean the Idlib area, under Turkish influence has been established. Turkey has a huge stake in those areas. Idlib is a huge concern. Turkey will never give up its commitments about Idlib. Turkey will never retreat from that area. There are 3.5 million civilians living in that area, and in case of a regime and Russian operation, those civilians will flee to Turkey. And apart from the refugee issue, Turkey thinks that if Turkey loses that area, then the next Turkish operation areas will be the next areas for Turkey to be pushed to be withdrawn. So in that regard, Idlib is a line that protects Turkey to be in the game, in the Syria game. So Idlib is a huge concern for Turkey. But of course, I should also mention the Northeast issue, which is still a big priority for Turkey. And this is the Turkish dilemma, actually, because when we talk about the Northwest, Turkey is trying to protect the status quo on the one hand, and also is seeking for an autonomous, not an autonomous, but a region which could be as independent as it can from this central authority for the Turkish-controlled areas in the Northwest area. But the Turkish dilemma is Turkey is also trying to undermine federalist demands from the YPG and also from the US and its partners, mainly US and also Western partners. So on the northeast side, Turkey is trying to change the status quo, and these efforts are ongoing. There used to be a military cross-border operation. Now the conditions are not suitable for Turkey to conduct a new operation against YPG because there is a deal between Turkey and US and also between Turkey and Russia. There are still Russian and Iranian elements on the border area. But apart from conducting a military operation, Turkey is applying pressure on its partners, mainly Russia, to fulfill its commitments because according to an agreement between the two sides, the YPG elements should withdraw from the border area below the 32 kilometers. Now, because of several reasons, Turkey is not putting too much pressure on that side. Now Turkey is focusing on the Iraqi territory in its fight against PKK. But I think in time, Turkey will also turn its attention in Syria and also put more pressure over the Russian side to fulfill its commitments. So the YPG issue is still a major concern which Turkey is seeking for. I think I will end up here. We will have a second round because I will also have talk about the Turkish priorities in the political solution area, which is also related, which I already mentioned here. So I will end up here. Maybe we will continue in the second round.
Thank you very much, Dr. Orhan. In fact, exactly when you started talking about formulas for future Syria and specifically in the Northeast, I said that this is exactly the Turkey's interest, in fact, in the future of the political solution in Syria. This is probably among all players, it is the most vital interest for Turkey, I think. And this is something we'll get back to. Thank you so much. I will turn now to another player whom we can think of as a main loser in Syria, the Gulf states, if we can take the Gulf as such, but I will focus here mainly on the 2 or 3 main powers who were really big players in Syria, mainly the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and in another way, Qatar. And turn to you, Hussein Ibish. You are not a Gulfi, but you are a senior scholar at the Arab Gulf Institute in Washington. And you are, I think, very privy to the way some of the Gulf states perceive their security and their national interest. And I think that also by identity, I mean, you are close to Syria. So what can you tell us about how much is the Gulf, let's say, a loser in Syria? How much is it trying to wedge or to, in a way, cover this loss by today betting on Russia being a little bit let's say, the tool that will put Iran at distance in Syria so that the Gulfi interest can be assured? And what if this doesn't work? Will this normalization that we are seeing underway between the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and others with the regime, will it go on regardless of what will happen with Iran's entrenchment in Syria? I think you are the one to answer these questions, and I really thank you.
I'll do my best.
The floor is yours, Hussein.
Thank you so much. I'll do my best. It's hard to speak about 6 countries simultaneously when they don't agree on anything much. So I'll try and do that as quickly as I can. And just let me thank you for including me on this very distinguished panel. I appreciate it. I think the first thing to understand about the 6 GCC countries is that they all find themselves, whether they're one of the 3 that try to project power in one way or another, that's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, whether it's soft, hard, sticky, whatever, they try to, project their influence in the region, or one of the 3 that don't do that, Oman, Bahrain, and Kuwait, which don't try to do that. They all find themselves, and I think the powers in the region generally find themselves in a period of consolidation, retrenchment, and maneuver. Right, the wars, the conflicts for external players, right, have almost all of them reached the point of diminishing returns, right, and one way or another they've been resolved. There's a regime victory in Syria, right, in Libya there's a stalemate. In Yemen, you can see where the war against Houthis is going. So in my view, we and I think that the Gulf certainly, generally, they all believe that it's the time now for diplomacy, for politics and investment, that giving money to proxy groups and to armed forces to try to make gains on the battlefield is very 2019 and 2018 and 2017. I mean, 2021, that's not the game. So that drives them, I think, a great deal. And all of this, of course, also is in the context of a reduced American engagement. I think the Biden administration made it pretty clear that not only do they share the goal of previous administrations of drawing back from the Middle East, including the Gulf, I think they've also hinted that they think the only really vital American interest in the Middle East is Iran's nuclear weapons program. and everything else is sort of secondary, tertiary, negotiable, something like that. And they're learning that that's wrong, but that's the attitude they came in with, and it's going to take a little time to shift them. So the Gulf countries, I think, all know this. So they have to operate also in that context, because all 6 of them are generally in a pro-American camp, right? So unlike the other countries that we've been talking about here and other forces, the Gulf countries have no direct role in Syria. They don't have any forces on the ground. They really basically don't have any proxies left because of the way the opposition has, generally speaking, come to fall into camps that don't really appeal to most of them very much. And their interest really, therefore, is by definition indirect, right? And more than the other players here. And I think it is still very much the case that they do have very deep interests. First, of course, is combating ISIS and preventing a resurgence of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Secondly, encountering the power of pro-Iranian militias and Iran's interests in general, and especially almost all the Gulf countries, the ones you identified as the big losers. Qatar is more complicated, but basically they're very, very concerned about working with the United States and others to prevent the establishment of a secured military corridor running through Iraq and Syria from Iran into Lebanon. Right, you can use any term you like to describe that, but that's what I'm talking about here. And some of them, the UAE in particular, are also concerned about containing in the long run, but in the very long run, Turkey's regional ambitions, which would have to get to them through Syria. In other words, it wouldn't likely influence the Gulf if it weren't more influential in Syria and Iraq first. So sort of that's a long-term concern, particularly, I think, for the UAE, which tends to view Turkey's regional role through an ideological framework. If the goal, since the fall of Aleppo and the war basically ended when the rebel-held parts of Aleppo fell to the regime and its supporting surging powers, Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, if that essentially meant that the war ended, and I think most of them did conclude that the main war in most of Syria was over at that point, they then had to think about how to best use their influence to prevent Iran and its network of regional militias led by Hezbollah from emerging as the big winner. And that has come down, generally speaking, to mean trying to find a way to work with of course, the US, but also then with Russia and with Turkey, and eventually with the regime to find out how to do that. This is the strategy right now. The question is, how do you do it? And there's where you get differences. Oman was the first to go back. They never really turned their back on the regime. Even in 2015, they were meeting with the foreign minister of Oman, went to Damascus, and they were never key. They didn't think they had any interests in the Syrian war particularly. So it's easy for them to go back, and they like to maintain ties with everybody and mediate. So there's no surprise there. The break, though, is with the UAE, which was never comfortable with a lot of the opposition. A lot of the opposition, both political and especially militarized, was too Islamist for the UAE's tastes, and they were never keen on it. And they see they were not happy with the Bashar government, but they see some resonance with the purported secularism of the regime, with its anti-Islamist stance and all of that. They feel this is something they can work with. And now they have to work with it, they believe. And they believe the others will have to work with the regime as well, having secured cooperation with the other non-Iranian parties first. So they were actually ready to reestablish diplomatic relations with the regime in Syria a year before they did. And they were restrained by the United States. The United States actually stopped them from doing it. They were about to do it. And the Trump administration said, no, don't do it. I mean, they were sort of confused. Are you going to leave or not? One day you say you're going, the next day you say you're not going. If you're going, we're going back in. The second time Trump said he's leaving, they said, all right, that's it, we're going back. So they went in because they said they have no choice. How else are they going to project their influence if they don't go in and work with groups on the ground, if they don't participate in reconstruction and purchase influence, to be crude, right? And use money and relations and carrots as well as sticks to persuade people? It's a very good question. So they did that, and I think it's really important to understand the UAE is also looking for inroads to work with Russia and with Turkey. A lot has changed, I think, since the UAE led the coalition that opposed Turkey's intervention in October 2019 in northern Syria. And so far as Turkey's ambitions seem to have pulled back a little, they've been burned somewhat. And so I think the UAE is more interested now in trying to figure out how they can establish a coalition of other parties to leverage against Iran. The country that's really trying to do that in a way is one that does not want to reestablish relations with the regime at this point, which is Qatar. Qatar is dead set against immediately restoring relations, but they did something very interesting in April. They established a trilateral working group with Russia and Turkey, but not with Iran, right? To create, they called it a consultation process for reconstruction. That has the potential for serving as a conduit for Gulf money for reconstruction that eventually goes to the regime, but bypasses Iran and Hezbollah. And that's, I think, the idea. And if that really gets going, then you can imagine how Qatar would come in with Turkey's imprimatur, not breaking the relationship with Turkey, but in the context of a growing kind of anti-Iranian, or at least non-Iranian, non-Hezbollah front to effectively prop up the regime, the society, and the economy, as helping the regime as little as possible, but nonetheless, they will benefit. But definitely trying to squeeze Hezbollah and Iran out, and the other Iranian militias out of influence in Syria. Whether that's possible or not, we'll see. Kuwait is trying to hold back. You know, Kuwait is allergic to, Kuwait's attitude is it's a house that doesn't have COVID surrounded by a bunch of houses full of COVID. And it doesn't want these germs to infect its delicate society. So they avoid controversy at all costs. And basically they will reestablish ties with Assad when they feel it will create least controversy inside Kuwait, where it's very delicately balanced. So their position, therefore, is once Syria is back in the Arab League, then they'll reestablish. It's the safest way. The big question is Saudi Arabia, and I'll end up with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is sending mixed signals because Saudi Arabia has the most offer and the most to lose, as usual. It's a very similar situation that Saudi Arabia faces regarding relations with Israel. And they're doing the same thing. They're keeping their options open, sending mixed messages, and letting Bahrain be the trial balloon in both cases. So Bahrain joined the UAE in establishing relations with Israel. In part, it's a test case. Bahrain is effectively a protectorate of Saudi Arabia, and if it serves as a diplomatic stalking horse. So that's a test case. The Saudis will see how it goes over time. I think they were not very happy with the Gaza war and what that meant, especially the violence in Jerusalem. I think that was an interesting lesson for them. In Syria, again, Bahrain joined the UAE, reestablished diplomatic relations with Al Assad, and I think in a sense it's again a test case for Saudi Arabia. The two mixed messages in recent weeks from Riyadh were Khalid al-Humaidan meeting with Assad and Ali Mamlouk in Damascus. Right? I mean that's a fairly big step. It's not diplomatic, but it's real conversation and it's public. Right, it's not secret. So it's a message that the conversation continues. You are not untouchable. You are not radioactive. So radioactive we cannot meet with you at the intelligence level. At the same time, Saudi Arabia just banned the importation of fruit and vegetable trucks coming in, which is a big blow to a tottering Syrian economy. They said, well, it's about produce, it's about drugs, it's about all kinds of things, and there's a similar ban on Lebanese produce and whatnot. But again, it's leverage, right? They can make sure what's coming in their country is tainted or not tainted, or is full of Captagon or doesn't have it. They could do that if they wanted. No, this is a message. So I think, again, they're interested in seeing, can this political arrangement with the US, with Russia, with Turkey, and ultimately with the regime be successfully utilized to freeze Iran and Hezbollah out effectively? The danger for them, and I'll close with this, is that Assad is not stupid. The regime is not stupid. They've proven that. And it's very easy to play two sides off against the other, get paid twice, and deliver very little.
Thank you. Very nice conclusion, Hussein. It rings a bell to many ears here, especially in Lebanon. We'll get back to that in a moment. I want to end this first round with you, Emma Beals. I'm sorry to leave you till the end, but as I said, I mean, Europe is, this is the voice that you will try to echo here. Europe is, by all standards, I think, and this is beyond any discussion, the ultimate loser of the war in Syria. I mean, it has lost on the strategic level and also on the neighborhood, humanitarian, refugee level. It is burdened with a lot of things, and its options are very limited today. How long will it take Europe, if we can talk about Europe as such, I mean, Brussels and many other capitals, how long will it take them to admit that they have lost, and how will they translate that? I mean, will they ultimately, let's say, go beyond or forget about the Caesar Act and embark on shy reconstruction and then less shy reconstruction? Certain capitals are already doing that. Second, for Europe, probably the specificity of Syria is that it is also a nexus with other places that are dear to Europeans' hearts, like Lebanon, for example, the stability in Lebanon, that will have to do with the future of Syria, we like it or not, but also the relation with Turkey that is an irritant today, both in France, in Germany, and elsewhere. How would you square all this in 5 to 6 minutes, Emma? And thank you for being with us. You are based in London. You are a fellow with the Middle East Institute, but mainly also you worked a lot as a consultant for many European agencies, and you are able, I think, to very ably reflect and echo the European interest in that part of the world. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Joseph, and thanks a lot for having me. And obviously, everyone has already covered a great deal of the ground that we need to cover today. So I'll try and keep things sort of relatively short and focused on the European position to the conflict, which isn't entirely clear, but I'll do my best to give an overview of the position. So it's not my opinion or indeed theirs, but what I think their position is. So in contrast to some rumors, I don't think the EU have changed their position on the conflict particularly, though we are seeing some variations, which is to say they maintain the aspiration to see 2254 fulfilled. There'll be no reconstruction, normalization, or sanctions relief until this happens. Now that's a position, but I think that the policy or action or proposed solutions are less clear. What was notable in the Syrian election was the fact that Bashar al Assad won, but also the fact that he did not attempt to moderate the process or his own actions, either by conducting an election that sort of gave a nod toward improved practices or plurality, and also where he chose to cast his vote in Duma. And I think, as a master of symbolism, that choice of where to vote was really important, and the message was clear to those to whom it was directed. So regardless of this rhetoric about, being open to refugee return and needing rehabilitation for those purposes and so on, the Duma vote really did send a message to the displaced and the opposition and the reconciled and so forth that they're not welcome. And that, of course, cuts across one of Europe's main interests in the conflict. Those primarily being migration, terrorism, and stability in the broader region, which are, of course, bordered in Syria, include JPCOA, Mediterranean, Lebanon, as you mentioned. So I think the election theatre, rather than the result itself, has not been very well received in European capitals. So if anything, the spectacle has, I think, hardened some of the positions in Europe, but given them an overlay of hopelessness. So to break it down, what we've seen from them recently, from the European Parliament, we saw a very strong statement at Brussels 5. We've seen similar around the elections and since. From some individual member states, we saw the same, strong statements on the election and its outcome. In the Security Council last week, we saw the same again, including reasserting the position that no reconstruction will be forthcoming without significant and irreversible progress on the political process, and indeed even some criticism of the text of the resolution itself. And we've seen harder lines on Lebanon in recent days and weeks, minded that the fact, of course, that the fate of the two nations, or the prognosis for them, is pretty well interlinked at this point. So the EU is a major donor to Syria and the region, both as the EU and as individual states. And so I think that they will continue that assistance across the board, though I think there's some moderating of this occurring in line with their reduced expectations of a suitable outcome to the conflict. Some creativity exists here on individual themes or issues and from individual states. So the Dutch International Court of Justice initiative, for example, and in general, they're doing what they can where they can. So more on accountability if it's through European courts, humanitarian aid, both in terms of oversight and in terms of funding, supporting civil society, and then some of the underpinning thinking around a future political process, preparing for future elections, track 2 initiatives, research, and so forth. So I don't see those positions or activities changing. They'll continue, maybe even expand, not least to counterweight some of the more permissive edges of Europe. So we saw it reported in the Financial Times the other day. It's no secret that some of the Mediterranean EU states are looking at re-engagement, primarily due to concerns about migration. But I don't think that that will change European policy in general. I do think that the split in approach will become harder to manage, particularly when we consider the paradoxes involved in the current situation from a European perspective. And in some ways, this possible split has constrained the EU itself recently and has constrained more nuanced approaches to the conflict. So as I said, while the positions are clear, the policies or proposed solutions from Europe are less obvious. States don't seem to be opposed to solutions, but they don't seem to see where they might exist at this time. And by and large, there is sort of a sense of hopelessness, I think. And, waiting for the US to continue their policy review and see where that ends up. Some sort of believe that it's now necessary or possible to simply wait until such a time as conditions or circumstances change or allow for some kind of deal. Minded that they're still focused on the deal under 2254. And here's where I would sort of challenge the perception that the election offers stability. I think with refugees and IDPs unable to return in the current circumstance, declining living conditions, aid donor fatigue, no movement on sanctions available because there's no movement on the political process available. The status quo as it stands right now isn't a neutral situation and is sort of largely unsustainable. And whether it's kind of forced returns from Lebanon, which seem increasingly likely, further displacement caused by declining conditions, a crescendo in the tit-for-tat violence, I still think there's a lot of give left in terms of a renewed crisis point in the conflict within the current situation, even if we agree that the front lines will remain stable. So in addition, waiting for circumstances to change in order to secure a deal, I think, is likely to ensure that those that change it are less likely to seek or create the conditions for the kind of deal that Europe wants. And so there's real risks in putting this in the too hard basket from a European perspective, both in terms of the likelihood of a new crisis point, of who takes charge of the next phase of the conflict, and the risk that this strategic indifference posture sort of creates nervousness from the edges of Europe. Within the cross-border agreement last week, I think we do see a new opening for cooperation on Syria, particularly through the US-Russian bilateral or a new contact group with Turkey and possibly others. And there's a range of options sort of bouncing around at the moment with how that kind of configuration might look. So I think the big questions for Europe will be whether they articulate and pursue their own interests in Syria in relation to any possible current opportunity, whether it's through a new contact group or bilaterals, and how their relationship to the conflict interacts with the US position under the new administration once that becomes more clear. Whether they see the new US position as too permissive and what they would do in that instance, and whether they are likely to create their own sort of set of policies or ambitions as a result of that, or continue to work sort of very closely with the US. And then I guess also how long their patience will last in the face of, you know, further refugee flows or significant declines in regional stability or changes to the regional dynamics, particularly where those undermine those core European interests that I mentioned at the start. So I'll wrap up there and come back in the next round.
Thanks a lot, Emma. In fact, you'll come back very quickly, because in the second round, I will start with you. Let me put the rules of the game for the 35 minutes that are remaining. It's a short time, and I want to go through a second round. And this is the game we'll play now. I will ask each one of you a question, a specific question that has to do with what he or she said. And you'll try to be short, 5 minutes maximum. But on the top of that, all of you will have the same question. And I will start with you, Emma, because this is something running, in fact, across all the interventions. The question is, what exactly is remaining of UN Security Council Resolution 2254? How much is it still operational, relevant, enough, or useful at all in order to talk about Syria, seen from, of course, the country that you are talking about? And then I'll ask also another question to others. So please go ahead, Emma, because in fact, for Europe, I think 2254 is at the core of the policy, in fact, at the core of the political position, more than any other party, because it is tying any reconstruction, any financial or monetary aid to a progress on the political solution. And is the political solution only subsumed, or let's say summed up in the 2254? And how could Europe look at a political solution that is outside 2254? 5 minutes or less if you want.
Okay, well, you put me on the spot a little there. So I think in terms of progress on 2254 at the moment, it's no real secret that progress has stalled and has been stalled for some time. You know, the Constitutional Committee has not met since January, and there is still disagreement about what the terms of a subsequent meeting would be. And I think that everyone broadly agrees that whilst they're not keen to interfere or stop the work of that committee, they are aware that it's not going to create the entry point for a broader negotiation that it was once hoped and that it would. And of course, it was hoped, you know, particularly by European states, I think that, and the US and under the previous administration, that we would get a new constitution through that process in time for an election under those terms in May of this year. And it's been obvious for probably 12 months or so now, at least, that sort of sequencing was not going to occur. So the elections that 2254 speaks about are a future election, which may be in 7 years per the current constitutional terms, and maybe under some other length of time if there was to be a new constitution drafted through that process and agreed that had a different term limit. So there's a lot of unknowns around the baskets, as they were sort of termed some time ago, within 2254 that have primarily been worked on. Then you have the detentions file, which is something that all states, tend to sort of raise as something very important to them. And I think a lot of the European states see this now as the next area of work. And that's been obvious for some time with their sort of increased work around accountability and looking at this file, because of course, it is something that matters to Syrians across the board in terms of finding out, where are their loved ones, and then the underpinning issues that have created this. issue. But what we see within the Geneva sphere is not a lot of progress on the detention file. So we hear a lot of people raising it as a very important issue, a lot of concerned statements about detention, a lot of wishing that it would move forward and desire for it to move forward, but not a lot of creative thinking about how it could potentially move forward in a more meaningful or rapid or comprehensive way than it is presently, under the sort of the terms that happens broadly under the Geneva process at the moment. And so in that regard, I think, the reason that we have seen Geir Pedersen talking a lot recently about the need for this kind of step negotiation, or, why everyone is really focusing on this discussion that happened between the US and Russia around cross-border, is that there really is a need to find a new entry point for that discussion. Now, there's plenty of subject matter under 2254. There's a lot that you could talk about that's mentioned in there. It's a very comprehensive resolution. And what I don't think you're going to see is really anyone trying to pivot very far away from that. And I mean that, across all actors. I don't think it's really in anyone's interests to get rid of all of that completely, because as you said, so much of the possible progress around eventual sanctions relief or positive resolutions to the conflict are tied to progress under the definition of 2254. And so I think that we will see it constantly referred to by all actors, not just those that really do still believe in it, but certainly for Europe, it remains not just, a policy idea or something, figurative, but very much the North Star, I think, in their approach to the resolution of the conflict. I think what's lacking, and I sort of alluded to it before, is the thinking about what the entry point into that is now that we have this reduced sort of set of options with regard to the baskets that were laid out. But remember, those baskets were laid out, they weren't fulsome. They didn't cover off the whole of 2254. So there still is a ton of things that could be done. And I think we've heard a lot about step for step. I don't think we've actually seen many step for step proposals actually laid out. So I think that, where the conversation lies at the moment is there is an opportunity, there's a possibility for dialogue, but that we need to actually start to define what that dialogue would be about. What are the steps that are important, and what could be given in exchange for those? Who's going to be at the table when they talk about them? And I know that none of this is really very clearly defined in a lot of the proposals that have been floating around, and posited by actors across the spectrum. But I think that, from a European perspective, it would be something that they would be wanting to see, willing to have a dialogue about, but they would be wanting to make sure that it was very closely aligned to, I think, the 2254 sort of terms and conditions.
Thank you, Emma, for having played the game, the first one. In fact, just for the order, Dr. Sami, I will keep you to the end because I want to end with a Syrian voice. So please don't be impatient. I'm turning now. In fact, what Emma says is, for me, very cynical, because it's a reminder of the fate of UN Security Council Resolution 242 for the Arab-Palestinian conflict. In fact, it remained for decades until today, maybe a kind of verbal reference, but an empty shell in reality. And I'm afraid that 2254 will enter the diplomatic, let's say, lexicon the same way than 242 entered it. But this is another issue. Sayed Kazim, I'm coming back to you now. First of all, with your view on 2254 very quickly, but mainly because I want to test your diplomatic skills here a little bit. A few weeks ago, we met together in the Antalya Forum, and we were listening, both of us, to the Iranian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jawad Zarif, and he said, and this was striking for the first time to hear, that yes, certain mistakes were done in Syria, and he was alluding to certain mistakes that maybe Iran has made. What are these mistakes, to your knowledge? And if we are talking about Iranian domestic politics, we have a change in leadership now in Tehran. Will the new leadership persist in these mistakes, or will it correct them, and in which direction? I know it's a tough question, but I know that you are able to answer tough questions.
Yeah, you mean I'm able to evade difficult questions, yeah. And but let me on the resolution. I think my guess is there are different perspectives on the context of the resolution. That means the resolution was passed in 2015. Now we are in 2021. And I think let's say the contextual frame is very different. And if we are realistic and not just legalistic, I think we should take into account at least the interpretations. And you properly mentioned the resolution on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I think there would be different interpretation of this resolution, especially I mean 2254 on the time and the framing. And of course, you have different diplomatic initiatives after it, especially Astana process, which I think needs to be discussed and understood. Maybe there is a linkage here on the diplomatic spaces which was created. Now I am not in a position on your on the very difficult question that you have on the mistakes. I think let me be very diplomatic, and of course I want to not answer the question because it takes time. But I think when you are in a diplomatic position, which I'm not in this meeting, your country never makes a mistake. You have to defend the position wherever it is. But I think the mistakes he didn't mention per se on Iran. Look, I think it was a total mistake by Europe, a total mistake by Turkey, a total mistake by, I mean, not searching for political solutions in the beginning. I think it's one of the most important cases to be studied. We heard, I was very impressed by Dr. Hossein Ibish analysis on the detail of this individual states of GCC. So I think Syrian case is replete of mistakes. And I think a strategic mistake. And I think the most important mistake I end here by, let's say, those who made this situation was a broad regional social engineering under the cover of human rights. They wanted to change the geopolitics of region. And I think many lives were lost, many opportunities were lost, and we are as we are. So I think I don't go to the Iranian mistake, but I think it was a strategic mistake and miscalculation by many players that brought it to. And as I said, Iran was consistent in its positioning and still is consistent on its perspective.
Thank you, Said Kazim. I appreciate, I mean, you said a few things. If we hear between the lines, I think you said a few things. I thank you very much for your candidness and your frankness. Irina, you were a little bit, let's say, unjustly treated in the first round because your sound system was not very good. I'm coming back to you with a little bit of the same, let's say, disclosure. A few months ago, we were also together in Moscow at the Valdai Forum. And I remember that we had a very interesting talk with Minister Lavrov. And he said, for the first time also, he admitted that Syria was becoming a frozen conflict. And you know that for many specialists of international relations, Russia's speciality in a way for certain conflicts is frozen conflict. Russia likes to be dealing with frozen conflict. Is Syria a frozen conflict for a long time? Will it remain a kind of bargaining chip that Russia will use whenever it has to do? with the US or with other players? And how much can you sustain the cost of supporting, let's say, a liable regime like the Assad regime without opening a real bargain with other countries or with other powers, mainly the US and the West, at least for reconstruction purpose? Go ahead, Irina.
Well, thank you very much for this very complicated question. Actually, I'm sorry I couldn't be heard properly at the beginning. So as far as Russian liking for the frozen conflicts is concerned, I really doubt it. Nobody loves frozen conflicts very much, only in case if you don't have to bargain. Because frozen conflicts are not for bargaining. Only if there is certain dynamics, you can take advantage of these dynamics. Frozen conflict demands too much from you. And as you probably know, I was to Syria some 3 weeks ago. And what I felt and what I saw there were on the part of many people whom I met, was their desire to perceive Russia as the Soviet Union, just to expect too much from Russia. And things which Russia simply cannot deliver because Russia is not the Soviet Union. So if we come back to the situation of social rehabilitation, which is really badly needed, if we come back to the question of restoring Syria and restoring economy, Russia cannot do it alone. It is obviously, it can only be a joint venture. Russia can do something, but it is not enough. Iran is doing a lot, and it is not enough still. So it is obvious that it is in the interest of international community to do something to make life for people in Syria easier, because common people, they really suffer. They really suffer, and it should be properly understood, because, as you know, many of these people now live in the territories controlled by the government, and this prevents from other countries from providing aid to them, from providing support, and it's from my point, it's not fair. It's not fair. They cannot be accused of living in the territory controlled by the Assad government. They cannot be accused of it. This is the first point. The second point is if we come back to the resolution of 2254. Well, I believe it is still a format which probably can be used. I cannot say that it was very successful, and here I agree with them. And then we have no other format on which all countries of the United Nations Security Council agreed. Though right now, and again, I agree with those who were speaking before me, I agree that Assad is much more assured, much more self-assured. And he has no inclination to discuss serious changes in the constitution or any serious changes in the management and governing of Syria, like federalization, like some other forms of giving powers to the local councils. He's not interested any longer. He is not. And the opposition also is weak, fractured, and not institutionalized. There are bright leaders who take some initiative in their hands. So that is why I'm very pessimistic about 2254. But at the same time, I believe it should be kept. It should be kept as a format, and Geneva should go on, talks in Geneva should go on, and so on and so forth. The last point I want to make, that Syria, from the Russian point of view, is not a bargaining chip. Nobody will bargain on Syria with Russia. Let's be clear, there are other issues. There are other much more important issues like Ukraine, like China, you know better. Who will ever bargain with Russia on Syria? No one. And Russia is not going to do it, of course. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Irina. Thank you. As always, you're very frank and very direct. Let's stay on the level of superpowers. I'm getting back to you, Natasha, for the US. You said something important, and I think it's in the narrative in the future about Syria, this will be a crucial point. You said that since the Obama administration, US policy in Syria has been very much influenced or informed by this, let's say, this paradigm of pivoting to the East and, let's say, retrenching gradually from the Middle East and its problems. Probably today with China and other questions for the Biden administration, this is more so the case. And I think that we all Middle Easterners here in Lebanon and elsewhere should be aware of this. And we should be well inclined to start integrating this given. But let's get back to Syria. If this is the case for the future, what will it mean for the US in Syria, but mainly also, and this is the paradox, if the relation between the US and Russia, between Putin and Biden, does not soothe very well or very quickly, will Syria become again a contentious point? And so it will prove this, let's say, this paradigm of shifting towards the East strong and bring back the US to the sands of the Levant.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think that's the question on everybody's minds. Just to speak to Irina's point for briefly, because you did mention that Russia likes frozen conflicts. As someone that just came from living in Armenia for 2 years, I would have to agree with you, Joseph. Russia was quite happy to sell weapons to Azerbaijan and Armenia for many, many years and got quite a lot out of that. And within Syria, I think it also really enjoys being at the table and being the deal maker, and even with the opposition. And I've written a lot on these cross-line kind of reconciliation or surrender deals. But unfortunately, it hasn't really been willing or able to make good on the promises that it's made in opposition-held areas in the south or in Homs or in many of these other areas. So I think Russia still needs to prove itself a bit. Its ability to get something done in a way that's much more positive, and it hasn't really done that yet. I mean, even in the lead up to this UN Security Council resolution debate on UN cross-border, there was an uptick in violence. There was a hospital that was bombed. There were water pumps that were bombed, which further threatened food security in an already very, very food insecure part of the country. So I think I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think there needs to be a lot more confidence building measures for us to get to that point. And it remains to be seen if Russia can play that role. I don't know who else can play that role. So I think that's another stumbling block for the United States. But certainly at this point, Russia hasn't really proven that. So I think we'll see. I mean, with regards to 2254, I would say that the public understanding of that resolution, there'll be less wiggle room. But I think around the edges, we'll start to see some give. And I think that's the important places to start looking. So rather than reconstruction, we'll call it early recovery. Rather than lifting sanctions, we'll provide waivers to sanctions, or we'll turn a blind eye to some people that start to do deals. I think that's really where we're going to see some of the slippery slope. And that's why I think that your comparison to 242 is very, very accurate here. And that if there isn't a way to make it a bit more feasible, given the current realities on the ground, and to make progress on issues that would really improve the daily lives of Syrians today, like what Emma was talking about, the detainees file. I mean, if you could release detainees or provide information on them, stop arbitrary arrests in government-held areas, these are the things that would really, really improve people's lives at the moment, and actually enable, I think, aid to really get to the people that it needs to get to. So, I mean, I don't know if there will be room for maneuver on that, or if the Biden administration will even think about Syria enough to get to that point. I certainly hope that they do. But again, these are kind of fringe issues around a fringe conflict for the United States. So it really depends on where they put it on their priorities list with Russia, and it depends on where Russia puts it on its priorities list as well. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. I don't want to take too much time.
That's already very much. Thank you so much, Natasha. Oytun, this means that at least for Turkey, Syria will remain a conflict at the door. I mean, even if Russia and the US are less interested in that, you are the direct neighbor and your interests are still there. I was struck by something you said about Syria being the occasion for hard power projection for Turkey and the use of the military tool. This is a very interesting observation. Of course, Turkey has used it efficiently in some places, inefficiently in some other places. It has broken a little bit the military tool of Turkey also. We have to remember that the coup d'etat happened within the Syrian conflict, but it mainly also caused the relation between Turkey and NATO to fracture to the point of maybe no return at some point. And so this was at a cost. How would you rate it today? And now that the conflict is demobilized and demilitarized, how will Turkey get back to more, let's say, diplomatic or civilian tools in order to deal with Syria? And is 2254 one of them, and what remains of it for you? Please.
What Turkey is doing on the diplomatic and political side. You asked about 2254 resolution. Still, this resolution is the base for a political solution in Syria from the Turkish point of view, although the context had totally changed, as Mr. Sajatpur had mentioned. But still, it asks for a full ceasefire in Syria and also a fair and transparent elections and a transition government in Syria. So these are all relevant, still relevant from the Turkish point of view. And in that context, we have two platforms to reach a political solution. You know, on the regional level, in order to deal with security problems, Turkey cooperated with regional powers like Russia and Iran at the Astana platform, which made Turkey to benefit on the security side to deal with YPG problem and ISIS problem on the one hand, but on the other hand, it also benefited for the Russian and Iranian side at the expense of the Syrian opposition. So Astana format was mainly focusing on the military side of the conflict, but I think it had reached its borders, its limits. Now I think Turkey is turning its attention to Geneva process, the Geneva platform, because Turkey do not feel too much comfortable at the Astana, although Turkey, as I said, made benefit on the security side. Turkey has a fully different vision for the future of Syria from its partners in Astana, mainly Russia and Iran. But Geneva seems to be a more preferable platform for Turkey to reach a political solution, because Turkey is still, as I said at the beginning, is still committed to its previous commitments with regards to political solution and opening space for the political opposition. So in that regard, Geneva platform seems to be more inclusive, and Turkey shares also common interest with its Western partners and also with some regional partners, apart from Russia and Iran. So in that regard, Turkey thinks that Geneva platform is more balanced, in which Turkey can also balance Russia and Iran with US and European allies. As I said in my first part, Turkey has different perceptions towards the east and west of Syria. With regards to east, we still share common views with Russia and Iran in the context of territorial integrity and political unity, not allowing a federal federal state in Syria. But on the Western side, about Idlib and also limiting Russia in Iran and also pressuring the Assad regime to give some political concessions in the political solution process. So in that regard, we also share common interests with the West. So in that regard, Turkey is trying to play a dual policy in Syria. In some cases, in different fields, they cooperate with its Western partners, with its NATO allies. In Idlib, for example, although Turkey is criticizing its NATO allies for not giving too much, for not helping Turkish concerns, but still we share common issues like the flow of refugees and also a possible regime and Russian military operation. But on the eastern side, the NATO itself and also the main NATO partners, Turkish partners, are the source of the problem. They are not helping, but they are the source of the problem. That is also another issue. In that regard, we mainly cooperate with other parties. So, as I said, Turkey has different interests and different perceptions in that regard. And NATO seems to be a not reliable partner for Turkey. Turkey mainly relies its own power, its own resources. Turkey is asking for more help, but also knows that there will be no more help with regards to fight against terrorism, because there is a total different identification of the terrorism, what the terrorists are in Syria. So in that regard, Turkey knows that there will be no deal about that issue, and Turkey will seek to limit the risks and the security threats originating from the east of Syria on itself. But on the West, as I said, as a dual policy, Turkey will continue to cooperate with its Western partners. For example, the recent humanitarian aid issue, the UN humanitarian distribution in Syria. So in that regard, we are at the same page with US, with European allies to distribute humanitarian aid, UN aids to Idlib area, which will create a huge humanitarian disaster, which could trigger a new refugee flow towards Turkey and also to Europe. So in general, 2254 is still is the basis for political solution in Syria. Geneva process, although we are still committed to Astana, at the end, Turkey thinks that Geneva process will be the final stage for the political solution, which is more inclusive.
Thank you very much, Oytun. Hussein, I'm turning now to you. We'll try to be, of course, a bit brief. I want to focus on this issue of normalization and focus mainly on the couple, on the tandem, UAE, Saudi Arabia. Also, when we were in Valdai, and Irina is here to witness, Minister Gargash was complaining openly that, in fact, the Emirates, as you said, by the way, wanted to make a rapprochement with Syria and with the regime for a while now, and that the main impediment was the US and the Caesar Act. And he was talking in a Russian forum, which was very interesting. I mean, complaining about the US in front of Russian guests, let's say. So is there a debate between the Gulf powers and Washington and DC about the conditions under which they could normalize again with the regime? And second, the other question, without getting into the details of the rift of today, how much is the Saudi Emirati rift now something that is new and that could be factored in the Syrian conflict?
Okay, that's really meaty, that last bit. The rest of it, yeah, I mean, for sure, let's just say on the Security Council resolution, it's a tool. So you decide what your policy is, and then you can say either you're not acting pursuant, to support what's going on because it's not meeting the Security Council resolution, or you can say it's working towards achieving it, and therefore you're participating and it's all fine. Or you can say it has been, accomplished and is fully realized, and therefore everything's back to normal. it's just a tool, and you know, however you interpret it according to your needs. So I think that's pretty much the way these things work with Israel, with Yemen, with across the board, and with Syria. Now the Gulf countries. All right. So look, it's not at all surprising that Dr. Gergash, who's right now here in Washington, and I'm with you instead of being with him, which is preferable, but still, you know, he's very active.
Thank you so much.
No, the point is that, you know, the fact that he would say that about the United States in a Russian forum, it tells you a lot about where the Emirates believes the center of power is and should be in Syria. All right, the United States remains very important for one purpose, which is preventing the consolidation of an Iranian corridor, of military corridor through Iraq and Syria into Lebanon. That is the US main goal from the point of view of the Gulf countries and also ISIS, but I think there's a feeling that for now, the ISIS threat is somewhat contained. If it comes back, there would be an American role. But I think it's got more to do with Iran's regional power, the power of its militias in Iraq, its militias in Syria, Hezbollah, and the border area. And you see, American power is highly concentrated in Al-Qaim and Tanaf, and these crossings, these highways, right, without which you cannot send convoys of goods through Iran, through Iraq, through Syria, into Lebanon, etc., or into other parts of Syria. And this is what it's about from their point of view for the United States. Now, if you have a broader policy regarding the strategic arrangements which have to do with Syria and who holds sway in all of Syria, or what the regime calls necessary Syria, or where Russia's influence is felt, and the parts of Syria that are effectively under the control of the regime, or forces that support the regime, whether they're Russian-backed forces, Iranian-backed forces, regime Shabiha forces, Syrian army forces, whatever they are, that there is potentially a Russian interlocutor that they can deal with first and foremost, because UAE has a very long-standing, mature relationship with Russia, as does Israel, by the way. The two countries that are in the US camp that ran together most quickly, UAE and Israel, are also the two most advanced in developing close relations with Russia independent of Moscow. This is no coincidence. These are the countries that are thinking, you know, most cynically, most clearly, most cold-bloodedly about how to manage, you know, the US fading back in the region, right? And one of them is to develop these ties with Russia. So that is what that is about. The US role is seen as very, you know, specifically to do with Iran and its network, and the Russian role is the broader one, potentially. But it has to bridge to Turkey. It has to bridge ultimately to the regime, you know, and sort of make a coalition of everyone to make sure that Iran is not the big winner and Hezbollah is not the big winner. This is the idea. The differences between UAE and Saudi Arabia, I would say probably not. They have to do with a lot of, you know, nuances, but in the end, the rift can be overstated, right? These are still two status quo powers. They are still two basically pro-American powers. They are still two powers who have three main threats in the region, all right? The Islamist, Salafist jihadist groups, right? Iran and its network of armed militias, and Turkey. Now, they don't see them in the same way. For example, UAE sees Turkey as the head of this Sunni Islamist fledgling coalition that they think could be some parallel to Iran or something. They view it in very ideological terms. Saudi Arabia does not. They see Turkey as a rising hegemon, another big power. They don't look at it in quite the same way, but they're less alarmed. But they have the same basic threat perception. So in the end, they will end up on the same side. In almost any dispute, when it becomes confrontational, when it becomes armed again, when it becomes about basic interests, you're going to see the UAE and Saudi Arabia ending up putting their differences aside, in my view, because their core interests remain the same. As long as we're in this situation of consolidation and maneuver and reaching out and dancing around diplomatically, yeah, then you can see them coming into all kinds of differences, especially when it comes to things like economics, where even the closest allies quarrel. And they do see the world differently, and they always have. UAE was never a protectorate of Saudi Arabia, and never, going and asking permission to talk to Israel or anything like this.
Thank you very much, Hussein. This was really useful. Dr. Khiami, Mr. Ambassador, I'm very happy to close this webinar with you. I think there's no debate about the fact that probably if one party has completely buried 2254, it's the Syrian regime. I think there's no discussion about that. So my question would be maybe elsewhere. You know better than anyone that this regime and this political structure is the world champion of playing on time and betting on time and investing in time in order to recover after losses. It has done so in so many instances in the 80s and in the 90s and in the 2000s. And probably the regime now that with time passing is going to regain vigor again and will come back to the forefront of many issues in the region. How long do you give this to become a reality? When could we expect this regime and this structure to become a prominent player, an important player, at least in the Levant? And this is a question, of course, that is very much of concern here in Lebanon, where we are talking, you and I, where some people are scrutinizing the traces and the proofs of the return of the regime to its prior, let's say, form and capacity. And so how would you see Syria as a regional player again? Others within Syria, but Syria towards other. How much is it possible, or how much is it still a long shot? Because Syria has a lot of things to repair. And this is the final word to you, and take your time, please.
Thank you, Dr. Bahoud. This is a difficult question. I think it will not come back in my lifetime, at least. However, I think the problem you're raising is a little bit philosophical. I think we ought to change the whole mentality of the whole region in order to come up with something different than what we have. Ultimately, we are still societies that believe in the leading dog principle, where the small dogs follow the big dog. And ultimately, we have not reached a point where we understand participation properly. And this is why we are not surrounded even by countries. Syria is not surrounded by countries that are an example of democracy or that are an example of good governance, etc. We are what we are. We will continue until the societies are able to rule their own countries. At my age, I'm reaching 73 next month, I'm starting to believe in conspiracy theory again, something that I have fought all my life. I am now almost certain that the Syrian society, not the government, nor the opposition, deserves something much better than its government and its opposition, or at least what was chosen as an opposition for the government. The main aim of my conspiracy theory was to set aside, destroy, cripple, impair the Syrian society. And this is why the 2254, like many are hoping, should be thrown in a wastebasket. And I think the powers that are ruling the world, if they want to save Syria, because in my conspiracy theory, they don't want to save it, for reasons that I will not elaborate. Essentially, if they wanted to save Syria, then they would address the society. Dr. Bahoud, we can go to a Beirut cafe and sit on a table, and I'll give you, for example, 10 names of people, and then you, because of your good contacts, you convince Mr. Biden, Mr. Putin, and Mr. Carter to come and create a supervisory committee. And then my nominees will face representatives of both the government and opposition in 10 places in Syria. And they will not only win them, they will even win the sum of the votes of both the government and the opposition. These names I will be giving to you in a cafe. So imagine how much the Syrian society is far away from its government and its opposition. Ultimately, I think a new Student Council resolution, in order to save Syria, must be agreed by the 5 members at least, the 5 permanent members, and that addresses the society. And it is rather easy to find a way to nominate an assembly that could represent this society in a proper manner and could represent the conscience and aspiration, the true conscience and aspiration of the Syrian people. And all these jokes about differences between Sunnis and Shias, cities and countryside, Battikh and Basmer against Battikh and Basmer, all this is to be thrown in the water, and we can reach a situation where really we can come up with a new system in Syria that probably we are a society that is proud, extending its feet beyond the size of its beds, as we say in Arabic. We will learn how to limit a little bit our tendency to extend our legs too much, but at least we would be represented by people who really should represent us. Thank you.
Dr. Khiami, I can't thank you enough for ending on this philosophical note. A lot of food for thought, besides the fact that we have now an appointment and a date for a coffee together, and I'll get this list. I hope we'll do this very soon.
But you have to bring Mr. Carter and Mr. Biden.
This is the second. This is the second phase. I'll have to work on that. Look, in fact, I think I'm sure that this was a really fascinating discussion and conversation. I'm sorry if it was not long enough for you to, take more time, but you said a lot of valuable things and very, very rich inputs. I really thank you for your time and for your readiness to be with us. Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs is really honored to have you as participants, and I'm promising you that we'll have other rounds of discussion on other topics related, of course. I thank you very much. I wish you a nice evening, and I thank our audience and our, let's say, attendees who were very numerous and very qualitative also. We will find you again soon for other webinars. Thank you so much, and good luck, and have a good evening, all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody. And I really appreciate it.